Thank you very much for organizing this interesting meeting, and thank you for the invitation. The number of pupils born in bilingual context has increased considerably in Italian schools following the recent migratory flows. At the same time, the legal recognition of disabilities, special learning disorders such as dyslexia, has influenced teaching and assessment practices, especially in second language teaching. We report the results of a language teaching learning experimentation implemented in multiethnic classes with pupils aged 11 to 13. Classes characterized by a high percentage of pupils with different L1s, mostly Chinese, and of pupils with special learning disorders, SLD. The aim was to answer some basic questions such as how can we improve learners' language skills and underlying linguistic competence as a whole through the active use of all the languages included in the linguistic repertoire of the class? How can we make language learning an experience of plurality and diversity also for students with SLD? How can we link assessment more closely to the teaching learning process? How can we assess learners' linguistic competencies without sacrificing their idiolect, their own plurilingual repertoire? And how can we promote learners' intercultural awareness and respect for cultural diversity? How can we promote dialogue and intercultural education? We adopted a methodology based on the educational principles of the dialogic approach. This approach, successfully tested for over 10 years in academic and teacher training courses, is an integrated approach to languages that fully recognize all languages spoken and learned by students. It promotes intercultural dialogue and adopts a broad, complex, interactive conception of language teaching learning process. This approach considers learning and teaching as the two sides of the same process of interaction, as the two-faced genus. Teaching learning or learning teaching is a cooperative process of active construction of knowledge and competencies that involves teachers and students. And assessment is part of this process. Dialogic techniques promote plurilingual cooperative learning. In fact, students work together in heterogeneous groups, sharing their languages, knowledge, and abilities through authentic tasks. Dialogic techniques are plurilingual. The linguistic repertoire of the whole class, L1, L2, FL, is fully recognized, are cooperative, as they involve cooperative tasks, teamwork, tests, are inclusive. Heterogeneous groups include pupils with different L1s and different levels of proficiency in language, skills, etc., and also pupils with SLD. Are intercultural, as they promote dialogue, cultural awareness, and intercultural education, and are technology supported. In fact, they involve digital resources to support language learning and to strengthen cooperation during teamwork. The dialogic complex technique chosen by teachers in the experimentation was cooperative bion, bring your own device, using cooperatively mobile devices and digital resources. A significant part of the experimentation was devoted to the assessment of linguistic, textual, and communicative skills through plurilingual tests specifically designed for that purpose. The tests were constructed to take into account both the pupils' plurilingual competence and the interdependence between all the languages that make up their linguistic repertoire. As you see in this image, in every communicative event, the speakers draw on a single source, the underlying linguistic competence, using all languages and codes of their own repertoire, including the non-verbal ones, useful to their communicative purposes. Language acquisition is closely linked in a dynamic, interrelated way to the linguistic and cognitive resources available through the practice of translanguaging, a very important strategy. The methodology and the digital tools that were used in our experimentation seem to be also relevant to evaluating the pupils' level of autonomy and their ability to reuse the learner resources in new contexts, in accordance with the new Italian ministerial guidelines concerning the periodic and final evaluation of pupils. Thank you very much for your attention. Now Raffaella Moretti will describe in more detail how the experimentation was carried out in the classes and the results obtained through the plurilingual tests. Then Irene Russo will talk to us about the tools and digital resources employed in the experimentation classes. Thank you.
Here I present you the plurilingual experimentation we projected in 2014 and we conducted in some classes near Florence from 2015 to 2017. It involved 133 learners from 11 to 13 years old. 90 learners had Italian as L1. 43 learners had other native languages, especially Chinese, Albanian, Moroccan Arabic, Romanian, Peruvian Spanish, and Russian. So classes on the sample were characterized by a great variety of languages taught at school, Italian, English, Spanish, and Chinese, a great variety of learners with immigrant languages, learners with special learning disorders such as dyslexia and anorthography. Our research sample was split in two groups, experimental group and control group, with similar numbers of learners and with similar characteristics. In both groups, we find learners with Italian as L1, learners with other languages, learners with special learning disorders, and learners with cognitive disabilities. The topic of the experimentation was food, and especially we focused on how to prepare traditional recipes. Food has been selected as a cultural indicator close to the experience of learners. But we introduced also other topics such as activities in spare time, sports, friends, and schools. In an experimental group, we used cooperative learning techniques and divided learners in heterogeneous groups, heterogeneous for languages and for abilities. We used dialogic approach through an integrated didactic combined with technology such as cooperative build. We focused on meaningful tasks to prepare recipes, and we used plurilingual inputs. We encouraged the use of the 4 languages taught at school, and we encouraged also the translanguaging. On the contrary, the control group followed a traditional teaching approach, that is, learners had lessons in a single language, they use lectures, they practice it in exercises on books. Our specific linguistic learning objectives were developing a plurilingual lexical repertoire, developing plurilingual textual skills, developing metalinguistic skills. We also intended to develop some competencies defined by the framework of reference for pluralistic approaches to languages and cultures. Here we have some of the competencies we intended to develop. For example, developing competence of distancing, developing competence in the construction and broadening of a plural linguistic and cultural repertoire, developing competence of the centering, developing the competence in profiting from one's own intercultural, interlanguage experiences, and some others. According to the FREPA, all these competencies activate knowledge, skills, and attitudes in action and reflection, valid for all languages and cultures, and concerning the relationships between languages and between cultures. Here we present some resources that we selected and we considered particularly important for our students. From resources related to knowledge section culture, we selected, for example, from section general characteristics. For example, knows that a number of cultures more or less different exist. From section culture, knows that the diversity of cultures does not imply superiority or inferiority of anyone in relation to the others. From section language and identity, we selected knows that one's own cultural identity may be complex. And here we find other examples of resources related to knowledge section language. From this section, we selected language as a semiological system, for example, knows that the languages work in accordance with rules or norms. From section language and society, we selected knows that one's own linguistic identity may be complex due to personal, familial, or national history. From section of plurality, diversity, multilingualism, and plurilingualism, we selected knows that there are very many languages in the world and there are many different kinds of scripts. From section similarity and differences between languages, we selected from knows that one can build on the similarities between languages in order to learn languages. From section language and acquisition learning, we selected knows that it's normal to commit errors when one has not yet mastered a language, knows that certain types of behavior can help the learner, but that incessant correction or ridicule can in the same way block the process. We observed learners during the activities in cooperative groups, and we noticed that they used spontaneously plurilingual communication, comparison between languages, metalinguistic observation about languages. In addition, the qualitative analysis we conducted point out that the experimental group had a high level of autonomy, a deep awareness of one's own learning process, a high ability to transfer linguistic learnings and procedures, and they naturally used helpful resources such as tips from plurilingual mates, online vocabularies, online pictures, videos, and so on. And these are particularly important because now they are key concepts used in the formative evaluation introduced to the primary school in 2020. At the time of our experimentation, the companion volume of the Common European Framework wasn't available yet. But now we could be able to assess the learner of the experimentation group using the evaluation scale for building on pluricultural repertoire, building on plurilingual repertoire, and plurilingual comprehension. According to this scale, the students of experimental group place from B1 to B2. Let's say, for example, building on pluricultural repertoire. We found that learners of experimental group acted according to social pragmatic convention. They explained or discussed the features of their cultures. They engaged effectively in communication, coping with most difficulties that occurred and repairing misunderstandings. For plurilingual comprehension, we can say that learners of experimental group used knowledge, even partial, in one or more languages as leverage for approaching text in other languages in order to achieve the communication goal. And they exploited similarities and recognized false friends, and also exploited the parallel resources in different languages. For building on plurilingual repertoire, students of experimental group began to manipulate language creatively. They provided clarification and they increased efficiency in communication. At the end of our experimentation, we projected a language testing, a specific language testing. Here we have some example of the plurilingual cooperative lexical tasks we projected. And here we have some examples of the individual lexical tasks we projected. All tasks presented multimedia inputs and required digital writing to be accessible to dyslexic and orthographic learners. We propose also the writing of a plurilingual email addressed to a real addressee, that is a plurilingual friend met during the experimentation. Here we have a plurilingual email written by a dyslexic learner. We can notice the learner uses all the 4 languages learned at school, and he supports his communication with a picture. Here we have an email written by a Chinese girl who used the 4 languages learned at school and who provided the translation of sentences written in Chinese, probably because she suspected that her friend had just a partial competence in that language. And here are the results. After the tests, we did a quantitative analysis regarding, first of all, the use of the 4 languages learned at school. And we noticed that the experimental group used a high percentage of words in the 4 languages. This percentage was higher than the control group because the learners of the experimental group were used to employ the 4 languages during conversation in experimentation. Regarding the expressive richness, we analyzed the variety of adverbs, and we found that the experimental group employs a greater variety of adverbs in the 4 languages, greater than the variety used by the control group. Finally, we analyzed also the orthographic and morphosyntactic accuracy of the written productions. We noticed that students of the experimental group always had better performances. And this is particularly true for plurilingual learners, that is, for learners with immigrant varieties. Surprisingly, even students with special learning disorder had better results than dyslexic students in control group. I thank you for your attention.
Good morning, everyone. I will talk about how digital resources can be used to support language learning. Digital resources can be used in multilingual context to support the development of lexical competence. All the languages are visible and recognized in digital resources, supporting the idea that each L2 is a cognitive resource. Digital resources make the learning process interactive and personalized, but it's very important that the task should be clear and well defined in order to avoid students' distractions. Plurilingual lexical competence can be improved with the use of digital resources, for example, building collaboratively a multilingual domain lexicon or promoting metalinguistic reasoning about the meaning of words in different languages. In the experimentation that Raffaella Moretti presented, 2 digital resources, Imagat and BabelNet, have been used for the creation of learning materials and at the same time for the testing at the end of the experiment. I will briefly present these 2 resources. BabelNet is a multilingual encyclopedic dictionary with wide lexicographic and encyclopedic coverage. For concrete nouns, it also contains pictures mapped from ImageNet. It can be used to explore specific semantic fields, such as the language of food. Learners can learn a word in multiple languages through multilingual definitions and pictures, and the comparison between languages at the sense level enable metalinguistic awareness. For example, naming the object in the picture in multiple languages is one of the activities included in the testing phase. IMAGAT is a corpus-based ontology of action concepts derived from English and Italian speech corpora, which make use of the universal language of images to identify the different action type extended by verbs referring to action in English, Italian, Chinese, and Spanish. It has been used in the experimentation to improve metalinguistic awareness, comparing the action denoted by the same verb in multiple languages. Learners are invited to list the features that differentiate the action. For example, in the testing phase, a video from IMAGAT was included. We asked pupils to describe the essential features that characterize the action. I will show you the video. The action is colare. Digital resources in language testing can be used, and they have been used. As we know, technology enhanced assessment in language testing has advantage and drawbacks. Computer-assisted language testings started in the 90s is today widely used, but further advancements are possible. For example, computer adaptive tests, automatic generation of items. The use of multimedia items makes the language test more authentic. But it's very important to have a simple interface design in order to have no technical interference. And as our experimentation show, digital resources can be integrated in the testing phase if they have been available during teaching learning process. I will conclude with some final remarks about our experimentation. The results confirm the validity of the methodology adopted based on plurilingual heterogeneous cooperative group work in which students share their languages, knowledge, abilities, and skills. The results also confirm that the plurilingual tests are adequate to assess pupils' linguistic and communicative competencies in multi-ethnic classes without sacrificing part of their linguistic repertoire. They seem also to be adequate in the case of pupils with SLD. The use of technology in teamwork enhances the cooperative effect of the methodology adopted and enables students to work as a learning community. Digital resources can be successfully integrated in the testing with some caveats. Thank you for your attention. Here are some bibliographic references.